ستستمع الجمعية إلى
The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Danilo Medina Sanchez, President of the Dominican Republic. I request protocol to escort His Excellency.
يشرفني باسم الجمعية العامة.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome to the United Nations His Excellency Danilo Medina Sanchez, President of the Dominican Republic, and to invite him to address the Assembly.
Excelentísimo señor
Your Excellency, Mr. Mungens Likitoft, President of the 70th Session of the General Assembly of the United Nations. Distinguished heads of state and government, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor for me to be participating once again in this General Assembly, representing the people and the government of the Dominican Republic. May I begin by greeting and congratulating Mr. Likitoft on his election to the presidency of this 70th session of the General Assembly. This anniversary gives us an opportunity to put into perspective what the United Nations has meant to mankind. It was established 70 years ago after the dreadful horrors of war. It was the first global forum to preserve peace, coexistence, and the well-being of all human beings. It's true the United Nations was born of the wounds, the pain, and the fear of the great conflicts of the 20th century. But it was also born from the unstoppable force of hope and the iron will of great men and women who believed in dialogue, solidarity, and the greatness of our humanity. Though we still have far to go, and the challenges before the globalized world are huge, nevertheless, the United Nations continues to represent the values that are a daily inspiration to us. Over the last year, the international community has experienced difficult challenges, but there are some encouraging developments which we welcome. We have seen the reopening of embassies between the United States and Cuba, and this brings close the day when this decades-long situation will be ended once and for all. And we are also showing our renewed commitment to global development in the post-2015 agenda development. At the same time, the industrialized nations have stepped forward to fight climate change firmly and resolutely. We welcome that political will because we have been calling it for quite some time. It is an action based on responsibility and justice, so that we can have a fairer model in the allocation of responsibilities between rich and poor countries. Ladies and gentlemen, the post-2015 development agenda is an excellent chance to focus on what we believe is the true enemy of sustainable development, namely inequality. Combating inequality is a point of departure for solving most of the global challenges. And yet, it is still the main challenge facing us throughout the world, and very specifically in Latin America. If we look at what has been achieved, we can see there are highlights and more shadowed areas. There are grounds for happiness, but there are also urgent calls for action. On the one hand, Latin America is, after Asia, the area where most people are in the middle class, over 130 million by 2030, according to OECD. And yet, along with sub-Saharan Africa, it is the area with the greatest inequality in the world. Today, the 10% richest Latin Americans have 32% of all of the income. The 40% poorest have 15%. So we are struggling to combat poverty, but this is aggravated by inequality. An excellent study was published last year by ECLAC entitled Instability and Inequality. It showed that achieving greater equality requires two very deep-seated changes, a change in production and a change in distribution or allocation. In other words, we have to grow in order to achieve equality, but we have to try to be equal in order to grow. We need a responsible production sector, ensuring wealth is produced at all levels of society. But we also need an active and efficient state to allocate wealth and to create opportunities. We have to talk about inequality in Latin America. As we move towards progress, there are different approaches, there are different roads, different ways of traveling. According to a study carried out recently by ECLAC and the German Cooperation Agency in 18 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, there is one fast-track approach with globalized corporations linked into international trade that account for 67% of the GDP, but provide only 20% of the jobs. Then there's a kind of middle road, small and medium enterprises. They account for 22.5% of the GDP and 30% of the jobs. And then lastly, we have a third ordinary road, micro enterprises and the informal economy. This accounts for only 10.5% of the GDP, of the wealth of the country, but it provides 50% of the jobs. So as the ECLAC study shows, this is a structure based on inequality. And so enormous changes are needed in order to correct the situation and ensure that we all move ahead at the same speed. We need to change the production, the structure of the production. We have to put an end to the old ways and move ahead to a model which will benefit everybody. It's essential that the middle way be promoted in particular. Public policies must help to ensure that the small and medium enterprises have better access to credit and are more competitive, productive and innovative. And they must also become more globalized. And in that way, they will be able to provide not just more jobs, but proper jobs, high-quality jobs, and they will be able to hire increasingly well-trained labor force. Along with the changes in the structure of our economies, we also have to combat inequality at the level of the state. The state has a role as an efficient redistributor of wealth, as a creator of opportunities and as a defender of the rights of all citizens. Let us remember what happened in the 80s, the so-called lost decade. Poverty increased to cover almost half of the entire population. The policy of austerity, which many states opted for, worsened the situation and made recovery slower. The next decade, the 90s, recovery began, and there was major progress in key areas such as education, and that yielded fruit in 2002 when there were better educated labor force and they were able to benefit from a growing economy and to get better pay. The Gini indicator shrank by 5%. This shows clearly that social policies are essential, along with changes in productivity and improvements in the labor market. We cannot continue looking at the relationship between economic policies and social policies as an unresolvable conflict. Rather, we have to tackle both at the same time and move in the same direction to reduce inequality. We have to deal with problems that would seem to be endemic, but actually these are problems that derive from inappropriate allocation of available resources. Look at what happens to our young people. They have had more years of schooling than anybody else in our entire history. And yet there are more unemployed among them and those with part-time jobs. The paradox is that according to tests, although they have more years of schooling, only 1/3 of poor students reach minimum reading competency levels. The labor market is increasingly digitalized, and this means that soon, instead of choosing between qualified and unqualified workers, it will be a question of qualifications or unemployment. So we have to go for good education and do this in a very serious way. The Dominican Republic is trying to improve the quality of our educational system. We are trying to carry out the necessary changes so that our economy can grow in equality and so that our state can be active in supporting our people. Inequality is the root cause of many of the challenges facing us in the world, including violence and insecurity that particularly afflict Latin America and the Caribbean. This is the only region in the world where the murder rate has increased over the last 15 years. There's a lot of discussion about the relationship between violence and inequality. Recent studies show that a 1% rise in the Gini scale leads to a similar rise in the murder rate. It may seem a little harsh to describe this tragedy in economic terms, but the impact of violence costs 14.2% of the GDP in our region. Inequality also is a breeding ground for transnational crime and drug trafficking, who are recruiting younger and younger people and destroying any possibility of a future for them. So one of the tasks facing us at the international level is to rethink our policy on how to combat drugs. As you know, next year, here, on the request of Mexico, Guatemala, and Colombia, the United Nations General Assembly will have a special session on drugs. And when that assembly is held, we trust that we will have done away with the old idea that drugs are a problem that affect only a few countries. The tens of thousands of dead people killed by the so-called war against drug trafficking cannot be regarded as collateral damage. Rather, this humanitarian disaster is due to badly conceived policies which are poorly executed. We have to have a change in the way we approach this. We have to have a new international consensus, more realistic, so that national governments can design proper policies depending on their circumstances, as some countries are already doing. In conclusion, distinguished delegates, may I resume the more optimistic note I began with. The international community has made real historic progress. Although we know that much remains to be done, what has been achieved in terms of the Millennium Development Goals shows that we can move ahead when we focus our efforts. Our experience in the Dominican Republic shows that if we have a clear agenda and we move ahead together, we can move fast. So our post-2015 agenda is leading us to propose a major alliance between the private sector, civil society and governments so that change can be lasting and sustainable. Where there is political will, no challenge is too big for us. We will find the will to deal with all the challenges. The post-2015 agenda is an opportunity to focus our efforts on the root causes of our problems. The moment is now, the responsibility is ours. And so let us work together for equal opportunity, equal access and development for all of our citizens. Let us work together for equity, solidarity and a fair allocation of the resources of the planet Earth where we all live. Thank you very much.
باسم الجمعية العامة أود
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Dominican Republic for the statement just made. May I request representatives to remain seated while we greet the President.